Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video which was requested by a lot of my subscribers, which I completely understand because it is indeed an interesting topic, and I'm really excited to bring this video for you guys. And today I'm going to be going over my opinions on a beginner, intermediate, and advanced folder structure for any React application. Now, obviously, there isn't a right answer. All of this is going to be based on my opinion and also backed up by some research that I did for this video, and together with the experience that I have coding React applications and building large-scale React projects. Now, before we actually get into the video, if you guys could leave a like, I would massively appreciate it because it will help push my video to more people. And we just hit 10K, which I'm very grateful for that. So I would massively appreciate if you guys could leave a like or subscribe if you're not subscribed. And yeah, that's basically it. Let's get into the video. So initially, I'm gonna start by going over a beginner folder structure. So what I consider as a beginner is someone who has never coded a React project before in their life. So I'm just gonna show you right here. For someone who never coded a React project in their life, I don't think they should worry that much about the folder structure. However, it is nice to already start implementing some best practices into their project so that their code isn't as like very messy, right? So initially, you see that our folder structure will be pretty simple on this side over here because we'll just focus all of our organization into the src folder. And when you click on it, you can see clearly that the first thing I did was I deleted some of the initial files that come with React. So I deleted the index.css, all the test files, and I think that's it. And the reason why I did that is because no beginner will write tests, right? I don't even think intermediate people will write tests. I will only include somewhere to write tests if you're an advanced or if you're developing a large-scale React application. And for a beginner, you shouldn't worry that much about it. So that's why I deleted those files. And also, you can see that I created two folders over here. Well, if this is your first React application, most likely you will be coding most of your project in this app.js. But it is already very important that you start implementing some of the core components of React, which are, for example, separating your project into various different components. And that's why I created this components folder. Inside of it, you can put whatever you want. I can put a footer component, a navbar component. I can put whatever else I want, right? Just components that I want to import in my app.js and use it over here. And then if you want to write any CSS or anything related to styling, it is also nice to create a folder over here called styles or whatever you want to call it, where you can store all of the CSS files. Now, a beginner, at least in my experience, shouldn't worry that much about organization. However, as I mentioned before, this is a good way to structure a very simple React application, which will, at the very least, it won't make your code as messy as usually a beginner code might look like. So that's kind of my take on a beginner folder structure. Now, most of the people who watch my videos are actually intermediate, I believe. So I think that will probably be the folder structure that will be more applicable for your case. Okay guys, so now we actually got into a more intermediate folder structure, and as you can see right off the bat, a lot of changes were made. From beginner to intermediate, there's a lot of things you should learn, and it's a hard process. However, I honestly believe that it's harder to get started in React and get used to just building a very simple React project than to actually transitioning from a beginner to intermediate. And the reason for that is because you got to get used to the React environment, right? You got to be used to what components are, used to using hooks, all the different stuff. So in the beginning, it's very difficult. However, when you reach a point where you feel comfortable, it will be much easier to learn new topics. So for intermediate folder structure, I decided to go with the following folders. So the first one is, and I'll go in order from what it appears over here. The first one is assets, and this one over here, it's not totally necessary. Together with all the other ones, it depends on each case. But with assets, you would want to store all the audios, images, videos that you might want to have inside of your React app. So usually, at least in my opinion, for images, audios, and videos, I like to actually store them in a different, not in the file system. I like to store them either in a in a bucket, or store them in AWS or in some sort of service that provides storage. However, it doesn't need to be that way forever, right? For example, if you just need a single image into your project, then obviously you wouldn't need to spend your money to put those into a cloud provider. You would just put them inside of your file system. So in that case, you would use, you can create an assets folder and just store them like this. I like to differentiate them like this because it just makes it so much easier. And by the way, I know many of you guys are wondering why my folders look like this. It's because I use an extension. It's called Material Theme, I believe. It is used to just highlight your folders to look a lot better than what they normally look like. So that's why my folders, as you can see over here, the icons look a lot better. So this is the first folder that I would probably add to my application, and again, it's based on necessity. So only if you have audios or images or videos in your project, you would need to put those folders inside of it. So let's go to the next one, which is auth. So if you're creating a project which includes authentication, and especially in React, you might want to have a folder specifically dedicated to that. And the reason for that is because, for example, if you're using authentication, you will probably need to hold some sort of context, right? Some sort of global state that holds information regarding your authentication process. So instead of here, you might want to create your auth context. If you're using the context of API, obviously. And here you might also store some functions that, for example, the login function or something like that, that are very important and need to be dealt very carefully, especially because authentication and authorization are stuff that needs to be carefully crafted because it basically dictates the security of your website. So I would definitely make it so that it is very easily accessible for the developer to access those files. So that's why I would create an auth folder over here, and it is present in most of my new applications. Whenever I use some authentication in my React project, I do it like this. Then you would create a components folder, and this is standard for any React application. I didn't put it on. I actually put it in the beginner folder structure. Sorry about that. And it will probably stay for most projects because whenever you want to create a reusable component, and when I mean a component, this time I actually mean something like a button or an input or something more specific like I don't know, a button that does a specific thing that you might want to reuse many times in your project, then you definitely want to create a separate component for it, put it inside of this folder over here, and then whenever you want to reuse this component, just import it to the file directly from this folder. And yeah, that's kind of, it's pretty self-explanatory, and that's very important in any project. Now we have the helpers folder, which I actually didn't put anything inside of it because it actually just serves to, it doesn't necessarily need to be in a project. However, you easily will encounter yourself needing or writing a file that you don't know where to put. So if you're in doubt, just create a helpers folder and put that file there. An example of this is, for example, I had a project where I consistently needed to, I actually needed to use a function which converted strings into specific date formats. And I didn't want, I wanted to reuse that function many times, but I didn't know where to put it, right? And you might say, oh, if you're reusing it, just put it in the components folder. But it wasn't a component, it was just a function. So that's a good use case for the helpers folder because I could just make that function inside of here, export it directly from the file, and whenever I want to access that function again, I can just import it directly from this folder. Now, after that, we have the hooks folder. And again, if you it depends if you have hooks in your project. Some hooks that might be useful in a React app would be a use query hook, where you basically make requests and you can customize every kind of request, API, like every kind of specification that you might want to have in your application whenever you make API requests inside of that hook, and then just use it whenever you want to make an API request. This is a little bit more advanced, I would say, but get used to creating your own custom hooks because it will definitely help out with most React apps. Now, I can't stress enough that many beginners who are transitioning to intermediates don't put enough time on learning about hooks and their use cases. And I would just say that there's a reason why they the React developer team transitioned from class components to integrating functional components using hooks, because it is very powerful. It will make your code look a lot better. It will make your code act a lot. It will make your project more scalable in many different ways. So I'll definitely try to implement hooks into your project and store them in a folder like this one. And then finally, we have a very common folder in many applications, and the naming, again, it doesn't matter, it just depends on yourself. I call it pages whenever I make a project, but I know many people call it routes, many people call it, I don't know, navigation, whatever you want. It's just a folder that will contain all the different pages you have in your application. If you're using React Router DOM, for example, this is where your routes would be. And for each route specifically, for example, if I want to have a login page, a main page, a profile page, I would create an individual folder for each one of them, where inside of it, it would have both the CSS and the actual component that renders the page. And you can see that right now, actually, I didn't, in the beginner project structure, I didn't use JSX as an extension. I used JS as an extension, and I just named everything in capital letters. But if you're intermediate, I would heavily recommend using JSX and using this naming convention where you just put dashes between each word. And the reason for this is because you really want to be able to differentiate the components from just individual files that you use to help in your application. For example, in the auth folder, the auth context is a JS file because it isn't a component, but about us is a component, so it would probably be a JSX. And I just realized that I called both of this JS as well. Sorry about that. Call them JSX because they will probably return a component. They would return a component, so it would probably be JSX as well. So each of them, each page would contain their CSS and any other file or whatever, any other file that is specific for this page individually, I would put here too. And you can see that I created one for each folder, and that's kind of the idea. And I also put an index.js down here at the bottom because you don't want to, whenever you want to import the about us component, maybe you don't want to actually just import this, have to write the path to this folder individually and then reach this file over here. What I like to do is I like to have all of these folders over here, and at the bottom of this pages folder I just have an index.js where, as you can see, I write a little bit of logic where I import each component inside of each page from here, and at the bottom I just export these pages as a single object, which means that whenever I want to import a page or a route, all I have to do is I just have to import from the pages, and I just determine the route that I want to import. If you're confused about that, I can make a different video on what this means, but it just makes it so much easier to import stuff. It saves you a lot of lines of code whenever you want to import many files, so that's a little trick that I would definitely recommend. And finally, for the intermediate folder structure, we have Redux, which I just put this here because I know a lot of people uses Redux. I don't personally use Redux, but if you use, I know that there are many configuration files, many files that you might want to put inside of a Redux folder, and that's why I added over here. But normally I wouldn't have this inside of here. And now again, this is my opinion, so you might have different opinions, and I would definitely like to hear them. If you want to put them in the comment section, I will definitely be reading all the comments. And actually, there's some stuff that I would still add to the intermediate folder structure. For example, if you want to add validations to your project, you might want to create a folder for that, right? But I didn't put it over here because I believe that for an advanced project, for an intermediate project, it wouldn't be completely necessary. But for an advanced project, those would be completely necessary. So that's kind of the distinction that I want to make. And taking that into account, let's segue into the advanced folder structure. And now we move on to the advanced folder structure. So I even had to zoom out a little bit so you guys can see everything better. And straight off the bat, you can see that we added some stuff outside of the src folder. So one thing that I added was the config folder, which is pretty self-explanatory. If you need any configurations for your project, you might want to put it over here. You can also have this inside of the src folder. I usually put it outside, but it doesn't really matter. It's just anything that relates to configuration. Then one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind is when I'm building an advanced project, I can't imagine a reason why you would build an advanced project in React without using TypeScript. Now that's kind of controversial because there are a lot of people who don't use TypeScript, and there are a lot of people who don't want to transition to TypeScript, but I would encourage them 100% to, if you're getting to a point where you feel like you're prepared to start building more advanced stuff, I would definitely recommend to put TypeScript as something in your skill set, because it's definitely beneficial. Many companies use TypeScript because it saves a lot of development time. It doesn't have any impact, I believe, on like speed or anything. It's more about the fact that you'll be able to debug a lot easier because you're defining your types, you're building your application exactly how you believe it should be. While TypeScript infers a lot of stuff, so it opens up holes for bugs to appear, and I just think that if you use TypeScript, it would be very beneficial for your project. So for that reason, most of the files inside of an advanced folder structure will be either in TypeScript, or so TS, or in TSX, which is the TypeScript version of JSX. And also in advanced project, I would probably be using Docker. So I created a Docker file and a .docker ignore file over here, and I would be using something such as ESLint. I would be using Prettier. So I added those files over here so that it can, like obviously I didn't actually implement those. I didn't configure anything. You can see my Docker file has nothing inside of it, but those are just visual representation to show you guys that this is kind of how it would look like. And inside of my src folder, which is where everything starts happening, you can see that we added a few more folders, but not a lot. And the reason for that is because I want to emphasize this point, which is it really isn't about how many folders you have in your project. You shouldn't be just creating folders for no reason. But at the same time, you gotta like distribute your project. You shouldn't be putting everything into the same folder or everything into the same file. So the important thing here, and this will come with experience, is you need to find a balance between how you're going to organize your project, because at the end of the day, you're not organizing it for yourself, you're organizing it for other people. If you're building a large project, probably more developers will come in and look at your code, and you want to be able to make it as easy as possible for them to look at it and understand what's happening. So I'm not going to talk about the folders that already existed. I already talked over about assets, but you can see in the components, I changed my components to be TS instead of JS, which just to emphasize the fact that I'm using TypeScript. Then I also created a constant folder. This is because you might have some constants in your application. That's something that happens with time. It isn't like necessary again, but it's something that I encountered encounter myself needing to create such folder later on in my React developer journey. I definitely didn't use any constants or even find the need to create a folder for that in the beginning, but in the latest projects that I've been coding, I definitely created one, so I wanted to include it over here. Then I'm actually going to skip this core UI because I'll explain it in a bit. Then obviously the helpers, the hooks folder, all of those are actually necessary. Now interfaces, this is specifically for TypeScript. You know that in TypeScript, if you want to declare an object, or if you want to pass props, for example, you need to declare an interface. Now I wouldn't put the interfaces for props inside of here unless they are shareable between many different components. I would actually put inside of the individual component, I would at the top, before you actually declare the component, I would declare the interface that represents its props. And again, this is all TypeScript language, so if you're not familiar with TypeScript, don't worry, but this is kind of the idea. These are all the interfaces that would probably be shared. So I would say something like, if you have an object called user that you want to be using throughout your application, declare its interface over here, and whenever you have it, you're going to be using that object, you just import this interface, the user interface, and use it inside of there. So this is kind of the idea of what the interfaces folder means. And then we have the pages, which again, it's the same thing, but there's a slight change. First of all, you can see that I'm using TypeScript, right? So TSX, again, I changed it from JSX to TSX. And the next thing is I actually removed my CSS file, and that's kind of like, that's just something that I found myself, I don't know, with time I don't like using CSS, like pure CSS anymore. I like to use some sort of library that will, or some sort of CSS framework that will help me write my code better. And in my case, I love using styled components. So for that to happen, you have to make a file which is either a TypeScript file or a JS file. So what I like to do is I like to, inside of the component where I'm going to be writing my styles, I like to create a style file which is just the name of the component .styles.ts, and inside of here I create my style component style, right? My component. And again, if you're using any other CSS framework, don't worry. This isn't like, you don't need to do it this way. I want to emphasize this, but I'm just showing you how I would probably do it. And then for tests, test is a bit tricky because I like to think that I'm experienced with tests, and I'm currently using tests at my job. However, testing is something that you never get really good at it, and it comes with time. And I feel like I'm good at it, but I would say that I'm not as experienced as many people around the world, right? Obviously, but I like to put my test files inside of my test folders inside of each component that will require some tests. Some people like to put it in the SRC folder, but I like to separate it this way because I guess it's how I was taught. When in my first job at a startup, this is how they did. So I just kind of followed what they did, and nowadays this is how I organize my folder. But you can see I did the same thing for my login. Just tests, unit testing, test your components, whatever you want. This is what you would probably put over here. And this is basically it for all the pages. Then we have a services folder, which, if you recall, in the previous in the intermediate version, I had an auth folder, which in this case I put it inside of the services folder because you might have different services in your application, which might require some sort of folder to store them. And authentication is a service in your application, so that's why I put it over here. Some examples. Let me think about it. It's just different things that are independent from the rest of your application, but are really important to it. So authentication is an example of that, and I'm sure you can come up with other examples. I usually create a services folder, and I usually put my auth folder inside of it. And then finally, I have the validations, which this is for any forms that you have in your project. I would definitely recommend validating each form and making sure that the inputs that the user are inputting into those inputs or those forms are actually what you want. So over here, I would probably create a schemas folder, which represents all the different schemas throughout my project. For example, if I'm registering for registering a user in my application, I will put the registration schema inside of here. If you're not familiar with this, I have some videos on validation. I have a video on how to validate using Formic, which is a very famous library, and Yup, which is a validation library. So I would recommend you guys watching it, obviously. But that's kind of the idea. I would definitely have a validations folder inside of my application. And then I go back to my core UI folder over here, which I didn't mention initially because I hadn't mentioned yet that I like to use styled components. And this would be any CSS or any styled UI component that is shared throughout the application. I would put it over here. For example, this components over here which are reusable, if I had some sort of specific style that I wanted to use for this button over here, I could put the style inside of this core UI folder, and it would be pretty well organized. Now, this is the idea. I again want to say that these are all opinions. I'm using my experience to tell you guys this. This isn't a standard. You shouldn't be like. I'm not saying that you should do this. I'm just saying that when I was a beginner developer, throughout my journey, I always loved to watch this kind of videos, and I think YouTube kind of lacks this kind of videos. So what I used to do is I used to just go over GitHub and search as many projects as I could and just try to replicate their folder structures, and that works to some extent. However, like, if something works for you, you shouldn't be changing just because someone else is doing that. So I know it's kind of contradicting the point of this video, but I think that at the same time you can learn but not underestimate your own ability to work through your own project. You know what I mean? Most of what I know, most of what I use are actually side effects of my previous job experiences, how we organized in the industry, how we organized in a large-scale project. So I'm just giving some examples that I hope you guys actually got some value out of it. So that's basically it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like down below and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 3 times a week and I'm putting a lot of effort into this channel. We just hit 10K, as I mentioned, and I'm really grateful for that. So I actually have a plan for this summer. I want to hit 30K. I don't know. I don't know if that's even doable, but get your hopes high, and stuff will happen. I got to 10K, which was a dream, and I would never expect that. So who can say that we're not gonna reach 30K, right? So to do that, I would really appreciate if you guys could subscribe. And yeah, that's basically it. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.